It's the Resistance Report for Wednesday, September 13, 2017. By the way, if you'd like to receive notifications for all of our live videos, there's going to be a little button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen coming on in just a second or two. If you click that button, you'll get notification every time we do go live. Now, on tonight's report, I will go over, number one, Trump's most recent impeachable offenses. There are many of them, but they are growing in number, and therefore you ought to keep them in mind. So that's the first thing we will discuss. I'm giving you just a sort of a little bit of a preview. The second thing we're also going to be discussing tonight is Trump's most recent international embarrassments. Now these, with regard to the international embarrassments, we could talk a lot about many of them, but we're talking about just the most recent ones. We're also going to be talking about the Equifax scandal and how that relates to everything else, because it does, and also some upbeat news. I want to be upbeat. There is some reason for some upbeat news, but you have to wait to the end of our report to get the upbeat news. It's from Bernie Sanders, a handful of Senate Democrats. First, with regard to impeachable offenses, the White House today publicly called for the firing of ESPN contributor Jemele Hill after she referred to Trump as a white supremacist in a tweet. Now, excuse me, but the White House has no business demanding people be fired from their jobs for expressing a political opinion, especially journalists. Donald Trump took an oath to uphold the Constitution. That includes the First Amendment's provision of freedom of the press. That's right there in the First Amendment. A president has absolutely no right, a White House has no right to call for the firing of a journalist who is critical of a president. At this point, Trump's sensitive ego comes before our founding principles, and brazenly violating the freedom of the press is an impeachable offense. Another impeachable offense, so that's one. Another impeachable offense much recently, a violation of the Constitution foreign bribery clause. It's called the Emoluments Clause, Article 1, Section 9. Trump and his business partners have just signed a $32 million contract. $32 million with a Middle East subsidiary of a China State Construction Engineering Corporation. And this is to develop a golf club in Dubai. The deal was finalized just as Trump took office in the beginning of the year, and it was signed just now. The firm is the 7th largest company in China with ties to government officials. The firm has also been sanctioned by the World Bank for corruption allegation. The Constitution explicitly forbids these kinds of deals in order to prevent foreign powers from gaining influence over our government. That's why you have the Emoluments Clause right there in Article 1. Trump's brazen disregard for the Emoluments Clause is clearly another impeachable offense. And then we have a third impeachable offense. Again, this is just recently. This is just in the last few days. The president, any president, swears to faithfully execute the law. The meaning of faithfully executing the law, that oath, is very simple. Congress and the president, including past presidents, make laws. When past presidents and past Congresses make a law, those laws are still the law of the land. Those laws must be enforced by the executive branch under a sitting president. That is the whole point of faithfully executing the law. But Donald Trump is not faithfully executing the law. Law after law after law, he is just basically reversing what the letter of the law says. The most recent example is his Department of Health and Human Services is now using funds that were appropriated to explain to people the Affordable Care Act, so people could sign up, to explain how they sign up, to actually get them to sign up so that they understood their rights under the Affordable Care Act. But instead of using that money to explain the Affordable Care Act to people, the administration is using that money appropriated for one purpose instead to make videos and marketing and doing a marketing campaign that is critical of the act. So we have plenty of impeachable offenses. We already had a lot of impeachable offenses before. The problem is not that there are no impeachable offenses. There are as many as you want to find. The problem is that there's not the political will among the Republicans to actually have an article of impeachment and convict Donald Trump of impeachment. Now, item number 2, international embarrassment. He's an international embarrassment. What we're trying to do in the Resistance Report is pull together these threads for you, show you context, connect the dots. He's an international embarrassment in a number of ways, obviously, but today's news is that he is considering reducing the number of refugees admitting to the United States over the next year to below 50,000. That is the lowest number of refugees that would be admitted to the United States as refugees in almost 40 years. Now, you got to understand, this is coming at a time when the world faces the worst refugee crisis since World War II. Historically, our nation has taken a leadership position in accepting people fleeing violence and persecution from around the world. Taking in refugees has been a central aspect of the entire American story. Germany, last year, it took in 890,000 refugees. Canada is going to be taking in 300,000 this year. And what is the United States doing? It is actually shrinking down to the lowest in 40 years, the number of refugees we are going to be taking in. Even though countries far smaller than us, even though Canada, just to our north, taking in many, many more, 300,000 in Canada instead of 50,000. Oh, and by the way, the Mexican government, our other neighbor, has rescinded its generous offer to aid in Hurricane Harvey recovery efforts. Remember, the Mexican officials offered food, generators, medical aid, but the Trump administration never responded to Mexico's offer. So Mexico says, well, we're going to just take the offer off the table. Nobody even had the courtesy to respond. Nor did the Trump administration, nor did Trump even offer to help Mexico following the massive 8.1 magnitude earthquake there last Thursday that killed 95 people and injured hundreds. In fact, our president could not even muster a tweet to express condolences. So there we have, with regard to Canada, an embarrassment relative to the number of refugees Canada is taking in. With regard to Mexico, an embarrassment, not accepting their aid, not even thanking them for their aid and their offer of aid, and then turning around and not even offering any aid to Mexico, even our condolences. Once again, Donald Trump has thumbed his nose at one of our closest allies, our neighbors, brought shame on our country. He is no leader. He's an international embarrassment. He hasn't made America great. He's made America small and selfish. Which brings me to another small, selfish issue. It's not Trump exactly, but Donald Trump is giving a permission to Wall Street and corporate America to run amok. Equifax, you know, the big credit rating corporation that has your social security number, your address, your age, a lot of your other personal information that you never gave it. You may not even know Equifax has it. I went to their website. There's a little form you can fill in. I went last night because it said, you know, you ought to find out if your information was hacked from Equifax. Yes, my information is gone. More than half of all adults in the United States, their personal information is now hacked because Equifax didn't have enough boundaries, enough barriers in place to protect that information. It was hacked at the end of July, although Equifax didn't get around to announcing this breach of its security until recently. More than half the adults in the United States are now exposed to identity theft, and the question is, how can Equifax get away unscathed from this? Well, you may find interesting a fact that came out today. In the months before its recent massive data breach, Equifax was lobbying lawmakers and federal agencies to ease up on regulation of credit reporting companies. This is something else the Trump administration has invited more lobbyists right into the executive branch. Equifax spent at least $500,000 on lobbying Congress and federal regulators in the first half of 2017. $500,000 only in the first half of 2017, according to congressional lobbying disclosure reports. The Wall Street Journal reports that it's been seeking a law, Equifax, to limit the legal liability of credit reporting companies. Isn't that interesting? The House Financial Services Committee discussed the bill that Equifax wanted to limit the liability of Equifax the very day of the cyber attack. Instead of reducing the legal liability of credit reporting companies like Equifax, their legal liability should be increased. Why should Equifax have the right to collect confidential data on you, on me, on every one of us, which we did not voluntarily give it, only to have that data stolen? In fact, you and I and everybody else, we should have a property right in our own personal information, so that any company like Equifax that wants to use it has to pay us for it. But if we're ever going to get a sensible law like this, we have got to reduce the political power of companies like Equifax. Now try doing that in the Trump era. Oh, one other thing. Before Equifax announced the breach to the public, 3 top Equifax executives sold shares worth nearly $2 million, according to SEC filings. Now that is supposed to be illegal. It's called insider trading. Now don't hold your breath until Trump's Securities and Exchange Commission charges these Equifax executives. Which brings us to the more upbeat news. Lest this be a downbeat report, I want to give kudos to Senators Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, Jeff Merkley, and several others who today introduced in the Senate a Medicare for All bill. Since January, a majority of House Democrats have also signed on to a single-payer bill brought by John Conyers of Michigan, a bill that has been introduced 7 times before without nearly as much support. This idea, Medicare for All, has gained more traction among the public, too. Recent polling from Gallup shows support for a government-run healthcare system running now at 63% among Democrats and rising among independents and even some Republicans. And I think that's because Medicare for All makes such enormous sense. American spending on healthcare per person is more than twice the average in the world's 35 advanced economies. Yet Americans are sicker and our lives are shorter than in any of these major countries. Oh, one note of caution. In a recent Kaiser survey, support for single-payer Medicare for All dropped by about 1/3 when supporters were told that it might increase their taxes. Several liberal states saw support for the idea erode as the tax costs became apparent. In Vermont, the framework of a single-payer system passed in 2011, but it was abandoned after estimates that it would require doubling the state's tax revenue. A single-payer referendum in Colorado was vetoed down last year, 79-21, and a recent California single-payer bill was shelved after steep cost projections, though a commission is continuing to explore various options. It's vitally important that progressives who are arguing for Medicare for All, those of us who know the data, who have seen the costs of the system we now have, We must point out that the tax increases are going to be more than compensated by lower health insurance costs. In other words, it's not just the tax increases. You've got to see that those tax increases are going to be hugely more than compensated. So people are going to come out ahead, way ahead. It's still going to be an uphill fight, given the overwhelming big money in American politics, big pharma, big hospital chains, the AMA. We've got to get big money out of politics, folks. Democrats and Republicans are both guilty here. But Republicans are even more guilty. A few days ago, for example, House Republicans quietly slipped provisions into their budget proposal that would eviscerate campaign finance rules ahead of the 2018 midterm elections. The sweeping proposals would invite even more money to flood our political system. The legislation would allow churches to contribute to political campaigns without losing their tax-exempt status and lift restrictions on how corporations can solicit their employees to donate to political campaigns and prohibit the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission from regulating political spending by corporations and prevent government from requiring federal contractors to disclose their political contributions. It goes on and on and on. I mean, this is all inside an appropriation bill. And it's hidden. You see, the Republicans don't want anybody to know. I just let you know. And I could go on. There are other provisions, but I'm not going to go on. We don't have enough time. But the point of this exercise is that you need to remain vigilant. It's time to get big money out of our politics, not encourage more of it. This must be a central goal, which is why your voice is so important. You see, powerful interests stand in the way of progress, but if we, the people, I don't mean all of us, we're never going to get all of us, but if we are united and focused on positive change and getting big money out of politics, we will triumph. We're going to have to build a movement, more of a movement than we even have now, for progressive change. That starts now. Not after the midterms, not after the Mueller investigation. It's got to start right now. It is already going on. I hear from and talk with progressive groups all over the country, grassroots groups that are already starting to mobilize, getting organized and mobilized and energizing. But there've got to be more. Don't wait for the Democratic Party, folks. The Democratic Party needs to plug into all of this energy at the grassroots. And with that, I will take your questions, which I have not seen, but I'm eager to take a look at. Robert Bailey, how do we prepare for a Pence presidency should Trump lose or otherwise vacate the seat? Well, Robert, I think a Pence presidency is going to be pretty awful. The only reason I have said on record that I think it's going to be better than the Trump presidency is that I would rather have a right-winger in there than basically somebody who is unhinged and dangerous. But the worst thing about the Pence presidency, or a Pence presidency, is going to be that it's not libertarian. It's really basically social conservative. It's going to continuously take on rights that we have assumed and taken for granted in the name of religious freedom. And therein, I think, how do we get ready? I think we muster our arguments. We make sure that the courts have the right people as judges who are going to be sensitive to issues other than or in addition to religious freedom. And we also get ready for a lot of litigation. There is going to be a lot of litigation, a lot of constitutional litigation. Make sure that the next Supreme Court justice who is nominated by Trump has a full vetting. Robin Webb, why are Clinton supporters so resentful? Robin, I'm shocked that you think Clinton supporters are resentful. Resentful of what? You mean resentful of Trump or resentful of Bernie? Robin? Bernie? Well, look, in both parties, I think what we are going to see over the next few years in the Republican Party, we are already seeing the beginnings of civil war between the establishment Republicans and the anti-establishment Republicans, some of whom are Trump Republicans and some of whom are libertarians and the old Tea Party Republicans. And that civil war is getting more and more and more intense. I wouldn't be surprised if they split off and that the Trump Republicans formed a new party. The Democratic Party is not all that different. We've got the establishment Democrats, represented by, well, I mean, I've known Hillary for 50 years. And although she wouldn't characterize herself as an establishment Democrat, I don't think there's a way of avoiding that understanding and that label. And then you've got the Bernie supporters, the anti-establishment Democrats, who are much, much more concerned. I worry, are much more concerned about getting money out of politics and also getting our democracy back and making sure that inequality is not as wide and as dangerous as it is today. And that may also come apart. I wouldn't be utterly surprised if there was a new party emerging there. So the very interesting question, and I apologize, this is a very long-winded response, but the interesting question to me is whether these factions, these anti-establishment factions, can ever find enough common ground to actually form essentially a third party, an anti-establishment populist third party that is not racist, that is not vituperative and angry and negative and isolationist, but basically wants to get big money out of politics. Carol Ann Parker, you ask, what do you think about Bannon coming to UC Berkeley? Well, Kara, I'm not terribly excited about it. I'm not going to go watch Steve Bannon. He can go wherever he wants. He's getting paid a lot of money. I'm interested in, and maybe some of you have researched this, these people who are going around, these right-wingers or these Trumpians who are going, who else is coming, Yiannopoulos and Coulter, these people are getting a lot of money for speaking at universities like Berkeley. They're not doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. It'd be interesting to know where the money's coming from. The other thing that strikes me is this is political theater. What they really want, what Bannon wants, what Yiannopoulos, what Coulter, what the people who are putting up this money really want, they want violence. They want the left, whether it's called anti-fascist or anti-FIDA or the black bloc or whatever set of terms you use, doesn't matter. What they want is the left to be violent toward the speakers or the right, because then they can say, well, you see, Trump was right. It's both sides. My suggestion, whether it's Berkeley or anyplace else, don't fall into that trap. It's political theater. Don't be part of their political theater. Aaron Oberman, how does America overcome John Steinbeck's observation that socialism never took root in America because the poor see themselves not as an exploited proletariat, but as temporarily exploited millionaires? How do we embrace a more constructive narrative? And what do we call the modern proletariat? Well, Aaron, good question. I think that up until about 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, most Americans who were poor and many Americans who were working class and even many in the middle assumed that one day they would be rich. They really did believe the Horatio Alger, upward mobility, rags to riches mythology of America. Anybody can make it in America. But what's happened over the last 4 or 5 years, and I've been watching these polls very carefully, I've been doing focus groups on this issue, is that most Americans no longer believe in rags to riches, Horatio Alger, anybody can make it in America. Most Americans have come to believe that the game is rigged in favor of the rich and privileged and powerful. And that new understanding is the seedbed for the kind of third party that I mentioned before, that is devoted to rescuing our democracy and getting big money out of politics. Mary Arguello, pundits and politicians keep harping on how expensive Medicare for all would be. How come other countries can afford it? Mary, the reality here is that other countries can afford it because they're not paying nearly as much for health insurance as we are. We are paying more than anybody else in the world. We're paying for private for-profit corporations that are in the business of delivering health insurance and health care, and all of their executives who are in the business of maximizing their returns, and all their shareholders who are in the business of getting as much return as possible, and all of the marketing and all of the advertising which goes into luring relatively healthy young people and avoiding relatively sicker and older people. In other words, these other nations are dealing with a fraction of the costs of healthcare that we are. And so it is possible for them to raise taxes just a little bit and cover everybody. And that's really what we have to do in this country, because we are paying through our noses for a system that is designed essentially to avoid sick people. I want to thank all of you for being with me tonight, and I also want to thank Sasha Lightman and Andrew Santana for helping with this production. Have a very, very good weekend. We're going to, later on this week, we're going to have some interviews, but with regard to the resistance report, I will see you next week.